Second language acquisition, gender motivation, Texas Tech University, spring 2011. My name is Jose Watson, and the purpose of this presentation is to discuss my observations and motivation to learn English among ESL students. At the end of my broadcast, I will relate my observations to Gardner's socio-educational model. Finally, I will discuss how gender affects motivation. Motivation plays a key role in second language acquisition. It influences L2 learners' effort, what strategies they will employ, and most importantly, their long-term success with the language. Second language acquisition motivation comes from intrinsic and external factors that vary based on the student, task, and situation. There are two types of motivation, instrumental and integrated. These types of motivation can manifest themselves internally and externally. Instrumental motivation is learning due to a practical purpose, while in contrast, integrated motivation is learning another language for personal growth. Now let's talk about how they can manifest themselves both internally and externally. An example of how instrumental motivation can reveal itself internally is through taking an L2 class for an honors diploma track in high school. An external example would be that your high school requires you to take a foreign language class. An example of internal factor for integrated motivation is through an admiration of a culture an individual wants to identify with that culture. An external factor would be a student studying in another country wants to integrate into that culture. It isn't either or with students. It's not instrumental or integrated. Instead, one or another can become dominant with the second language learner. The first research that I would like to draw attention to is that of Orville Morer's psychological motivation. Morer's psychological motivation research was restricted to L1 acquisition. However, it has implications for second language acquisition. Morer proposed that language learning is motivated by basic desire to communicate with, become similar to, and belong with valued people in one's environment. This begins at home and then transfers over to the community. This is true in second language learners as well. Second language learners must identify with members from that culture group and inherit their linguistic behaviors and style of speech. The second research I want to focus on is Gardner's socio-educational model. Gardner argued that second language acquisition is a social psychology occurrence. These social factors influence motivation on second language learners. There are 4 phases in the socio-educational model: culture and milieu, learner differences, context, and linguistic outcomes. Culture and milieu refer to the environment of the second language learner. For example, second language learners here in the States are in a monolinguistic environment. Minority language speakers are expected to speak the dominant language, so English for the States. Learner differences refers to the variances in second language learners. These differences have the greatest impact on second language acquisition. The learner differences are variables of intelligence, language aptitude, motivation, and situational anxiety. Context refers to how the learner is experiencing the language, in a classroom with an instructor or through immersion. Is it structured or unstructured? Finally, linguistic outcome has 2 parts. The linguistic part refers to the language knowledge and language skills. The non-linguistic aspect is the attitude of the second language learner in respect to the culture. Within these phases, there are 3 elements. Effort, the amount of practice or studying by the second language learner. Desire is how much the learner wants to become proficient in an L2 language. And effect is the emotional reaction to language studying. All of these elements influence motivation. The participants in my study were ESL students. My students were Roberto, an ESL student since kindergarten; Mariana, an ESL student since 5th grade; John, an ESL student since 5th grade; and Leslie, an ESL student since 3rd grade. The methodology for this presentation was studying 4 student volunteers through qualitative and quantitative factors. For qualitative, I will use interviews designed around questionnaires, which are my quantitative factors. Students were asked to fill out a questionnaire that measured 18 variables on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being strongly disagree and 7 being strongly agree. The questionnaires were a combination of scales developed by Gardner, Tremblay, and Scott Casale. Based on the answers, I interviewed the students. Here are some of the results from the questionnaires. Out of the 18 variables, desire, integrative orientation, and motivational intensity were the best determiners for the sex of a student. Students with high desire, integrative orientation, and high motivational intensity were females, while the low scores in this area were males. The other variables had no significant correlations in respect to gender. I interviewed the male students and asked about their desire for the language, which both of my male students talked about similar pressures to simply earn good grades and go to college, not necessarily learn English. Learning English wasn't a long-term goal for them. The females, however, felt that they needed to learn English in order to act as translators for their parents. The female students also mentioned that they enjoyed learning English to communicate with others and never felt intimidated by English studying or asking the teacher for help. The males were the exact opposite. They found it difficult to stay focused and felt embarrassed to participate in their classes. The interview confirmed the results of the questionnaire when it came to desire, motivational intensity, and integrative orientation. It also revealed that the students had many social influences in learning English. Within their social circles, girls were more accepted in learning English, while the boys weren't. Instead, traditional gender roles came into play. Both boys mentioned working was more important than learning English. This project supported the socio-educational model, especially during the interview portion. Comments on peer and family appraisal or isolation were noted in both genders. Gender differences in motivation exist and can be determined based on desire, integrative orientation, and motivational intensity. Finally, instrumental and integrated motivation exist in both genders. However, their dominance depends on the task, student, personality, and context. So what are the implications in teaching? We know social pressure exists. However, it goes beyond what music to like or how to dress. The influence of peers affects second language learners' motivation to learn a language, regardless of sex. As an instructor, our lesson plans should reflect subjects and teaching methods to meet the needs of both genders. We need to be aware to these pressures and approach these issues sensitively. When it comes to motivating students, we as educators need to know why a student is enrolled in an L2 classroom. By identifying their intrinsic, extrinsic motives, we can better meet their needs for long-term linguistic success. To support this success, we need to decrease barriers in second language acquisition. My male participants mentioned fear of participating in class. Our classrooms should be the least restrictive environment that allows students to actively engage in the language without barriers such as fear. Finally, gender does affect motivation. Males tend to have a lower desire for second language acquisition. Short-term tasks that support broader concepts could help male students gain confidence in the language and increase their desire. It is in the understanding of gender motivation and social pressure that we as instructors will inspire second language learners to develop their own passion for a second language. My name is Jose Watson, and the purpose of this project was to discuss my observations and motivation to learn English among ESL students, relate my observations to Gardner's socio-educational model, and finally, discuss the effects of gender on motivation. Texas Tech University, Spring 2011.